how decentralization is reshaping our future. Now, it is time for us to consider a potential reality or a certain reality, depending on your position. Because as digital entities increasingly participate in the economy, we need to rethink the nature of work and even what it means to be a human in a digital world shared with intelligent machines. To speak to this deeply philosophical topic, we're going to be joined by a legend, Don Tapscott, who is the CEO of the Blockchain Research Institute. Now, as I'm sure you know, he's the author of 18 books, including his bestseller, Blockchain Revolution, which he wrote with his son. He is one of the most influential people in the digital age. He was ranked by Thinkers 50 as the #2 living management thinker in the world. And it's worth mentioning that Don's TED Talk has now been seen by over 10 million people. My goodness me, what a great billing. Let's welcome Don to the stage.
Well, it's great to be here, and I've had a wonderful week. Could I get my slide? There we go. Decentralization. It's sort of a mantra of the Web3 community. But why is it really happening? Is it a good idea? What will its impact be on institutions and society? And how are we going to get there? I've actually never heard a speech covering all that, so I thought for the Cardano Summit, I'll put one together and share my views. So I hope you'll bear with me when I stand back and take a big picture look at what we're doing here. Let me give you a little background to begin. I wrote a couple of books in the 1980s that nobody read. There were studies in bad timing, I think. But I started selling bestsellers in the early 90s. Paradigm Shift's obviously a big book, and The Digital Economy was the first bestseller about the web and business. And 20 years later, I was asked to write the anniversary edition of The Digital Economy, and I had to reflect on what happened and how did it all turn out. And the book held up pretty well, but I was quite struck by the issue of decentralization because I talked about the traditional firm and its boundaries becoming more porous and giving away to what I called an internetworked organization. This is in 1994. But that didn't really happen. It was an idea in waiting. It was an idea whose time had not come. And what's happened now is that there are powerful forces in the world and with technology that enable this to finally occur. So what I'm going to talk to you about is what is decentralization? What are the driving forces for this, both a demand pull and a technology push? What do decentralized organizations look like? How's the architecture of the firm changing? What does this mean for a number of different industries and our economy as a whole? And then how are we going to get there? So let's get into it. To begin, centralized systems have been the way that humans have organized the orchestration of capability to create goods and services, to govern themselves, and to create value. And in decentralized systems, there's a clear hierarchy of control. The top, a central controller, has the power and directs the level or the activity of lower level components. And hierarchies have worked. You know, when I was talking about decentralization in the early 90s, I got a lot of pushback. This is a very famous article by a guy named Elliot Jakes in Harvard Business Review. And it was called In Praise of Hierarchy. And the traditional business community just loved it because it went through in an organized way and talked about why hierarchies work, why they've been so resilient over time. Decentralized systems, they happen in nature, and they can happen with human organization, and they operate without a single controlling entity. And each component acts on local information, interactions with the environment, other components, and at the heart of decentralization is the notion of self-organization, where a single entity might act understanding that what it does, it's not only in its own interest, but it's in the interest of the community as well. So that's just some high-level theory about the difference between the two. Now, what's happening today that's changing this conversation that's been going on for decades, where the centralized folks have really had the upper hand? Well, there's a demand pull from a new business environment, and there's a technology push from the technology and the ecosystem that you're working in. So let's just look at those for a sec. First of all, the Edelman Trust Barometer is at an all-time low for traditional centralized organizations. The corporation, the centralized media, traditional media, and government, the institutions of government, are all at an all-time low. And there's a crisis of legitimacy that exists for these institutions. Legitimacy is the idea that you may like or dislike the institution, but you think the model is a good one, and it's the best one. You may like or not like who's in power in government, but you think, your model of governance is a good one. And it's also the growing distrust comes about from the behavior of bad actors who are, have abused their power. There have been data breaches from traditional centralized computer systems. And even in this ecosystem, you've had people that have acted badly, and they could do that because they had central control of the business model. Now, secondly, these centralized systems are becoming increasingly ineffective. The best-selling management book of all time wasn't written by me. It wasn't even written by Peter Drucker. It was written by a guy named Scott Adams. It's called The Dilbert Principal. You know this book, right? Cartoon. And Dilbert really nailed the traditional command and control organization. The top is the supreme governor, the bottom, the permanently governed, and then between those alternate between governed and governors. Your goal is to move up the hierarchy, get more people reporting to you, because that means the Hayes system will give you greater compensation. It's inwardly focused, it's vertically integrated, does everything from soup to nuts, and bureaucracy slows things down, and the organization can't learn, which is a big problem, because today, things are becoming so complicated that the person at the top can't learn for the organization as a whole anymore. And we've seen lots of examples of these traditional organizations. Nokia was the biggest provider of mobile phones in the world, and the second biggest was RIM with BlackBerry. And both of them had a very centralized and bureaucratic traditional model. Secondly, it's not just about the corporation. Hey, the world that we have has a lot of problems. It's not sustainable, it's too conflicted, it's too unequal, and we need new ways of solving global problems because the traditional centralized ways are not working. Now, you may not know the history on this, but after the Second World War, in 1944, 44 countries got together in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in the United States. And they created a bunch of global institutions that each had a headquarters. The World Bank and the IMF. A year later, they created the UN, and then the GATT, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs. They created the WTO and the WLO and the G20 and the G8, global institutions based on nation states. But increasingly, the nation state is the wrong size to solve global problems. Carbon moving around the air doesn't know about borders. And since Bretton Woods, some big things have changed. Seen the rise of the civil society. There were a handful of NGOs at Bretton Woods because there weren't any. There were 50 NGOs in the world. Corporations now, some, have become a second kind of pillar of society in the sense that many of them understand that they have to do good in order to do well. And we've also seen the rise of the internet, the traditional internet, where people can collaborate globally. So there's a whole new model based on networks of how we solve problems and even how we govern ourselves. Fisheries are not governed by the UN or something. They're governed by a global network. We even govern things like the internet. The internet's not governed by the IMF or the UN. It's governed by a collaborative network globally. And then a third big pull, if you like, is we've seen the concentration of wealth. And this is kind of going a bit against the arc of history, which is more the distribution of assets. But we've now got less than 1% of the people owning half of the economy. And the next 7% owning almost the other half. Now, this is a formula for all kinds of problems, for social unrest, even revolutions. And it's a trend that is kind of antithetical to what we would expect in the digital age. The economy is growing, but prosperity is declining in many countries. And then finally is this thing called the agency problem. Now, the idea here is that agents act in the interests of shareholders, management. But often there's a conflict of interest, and we see today that many executives and CEOs take steps that are not in the interest of shareholders in order to advance their short-term material interests. And one of the results of that is that CEO salaries have skyrocketed, and they're quite out of control compared to the salaries of other people in the organization or compared to the opportunity to issue dividends to the shareholders. So you put those together, and the world needs something different. Add the second era of the digital age, a new kind of technology that creates possibilities for something different. On the left there, that's what a data center looked like when I started out in computing in the late 70s. And the only people who used computers were programmers. And these were big, centralized mainframes. Now, the internet, you all know about that. It was built originally in the ARPANET to resist a nuclear attack and so on. And it decentralized a lot, but not the important things that matter. You see, because it was an internet of information. And what that means is that it was an internet that published information. Even with communications, if I send you a piece of information, a document, a PDF of this deck, I'm not sending you the information, I'm sending you a copy. And that works great for information. But it doesn't work well for the things that are really important in an economy, which are assets, things of value, things like money, securities, intellectual property, the data in our identities, contracts, deeds, art, music, votes, asset, something of value that belongs to somebody. You don't want someone copying your vote or your identity. And if I send you $1,000, it's really important that I don't still have the money, right? So you all know about this. The double spend problem, as cryptographers defined it. And the way that we solve this problem is through large, powerful, centralized intermediaries. And they perform all of the business and transaction logic of every type of commerce. They identify the asset, they clear and settle the transaction, they keep records, they enable us to trust each other. Well, what if they were an internet of value? And of course, that's what's happening today with blockchain, where any asset can be managed, transacted, communicated in a secure and private way, peer-to-peer. And trust is not achieved by a powerful central authority, it's achieved by cryptography and collaboration and some clever code, which is why sometimes we refer to it as the trust protocol. It's a native digital medium for trust. Now that opens up a lot of possibilities. The second thing is, if you look back historically over time, assets have become more decentralized. So go way back, the history of the world, the old slave economies that surrounded the planet, the Romans, the Greeks, the Aztecs, the Incas, the Japanese and Chinese emperors, they were slave economies. The pyramids weren't built by volunteers, okay? And the main asset was people. You actually owned people in the literal sense, and it was a very small number. Then they fell all around the world, and all around the world we had feudalism, where people were tied to the land, and the main asset became land. The nobility, the kings, and a small group of people, but larger than the slave owners, owned value. But then value and assets started to become more abstracted with the Industrial Revolution and the rise of industrial capitalism. So assets became abstracted into instruments like securities. We had the creation of the stockholder corporation, where a number of people could pool their money together and buy a piece of a company. And then over time, funds, where investors could come together and buy a portfolio of companies that were in a fund. Then we had things like the labor movement, where unions got together and demanded a bigger piece in the further distribution of assets. And as a result, today, one of the biggest owners of wealth are pension funds of unions. So that was kind of progress. This all gets blown apart under the digital age now, because tokens, a further abstraction, can represent literally any asset. Now, it can be a synthetic asset, like, say, a currency or a carbon credit, but it can also be a physical asset, like a barrel of oil. A token can represent that. And we think of tokens just as containers. The asset can go into a container, and if it's a physical asset, all the data about the asset and its movement through a supply chain or whatever can be tokenized as well. And, I heard an interview here a couple of days ago, and someone was debating crypto versus gold as an asset. And the gold person was saying, no, gold is a real thing. And the crypto person was saying, no, crypto is really cool. And the entire conversation was thinking about all of this as a speculative asset that investors can purchase. Well, there's a role for that, but that's just a tip of the iceberg. And a currency is not just a store of value or something of value. It's a medium of exchange. It's a unit of record. And currencies are one of hundreds of types of assets that can be tokenized. So this is a little taxonomy from my son Alex's book, Web3, which is a big book, best-selling book. But he makes a good point. He says this is a taxonomy, but it's very temporary, because eventually it will be stupid to build a taxonomy of assets, just like back in the Web 1 and 2 days, we didn't build a taxonomy of websites. We might have done originally, websites that give you information, and websites that enable you to shop, and websites that, enable collaboration. I mean, that's given away to this deep understanding that the traditional web can do a lot of stuff with information. Well, this will give way to a deep understanding that any asset can be abstracted, tokenized, and managed that way. So just to make sure we're all on the same page here before I get into the meat, first web, it's a computer lingo, was a read web. You accessed the web. You went to the web to get information. Second web was a platform for computation. Around 2000, we saw XML. You could write to the web. You could go onto Wikipedia, make an entry. You could create a social media post. But the problem is still there, that all of this is about information, and that information was captured by a tiny handful. We call them digital conglomerates. And the new web, Alex refers to it, and others, as the read, write, own web, where, enabled by blockchain, everything that happens with things of value, the creators of value can own the value. So, and then we have smart contracts that these were central institutions that did all that, lawyers and rules and laws and big corporations and so on, these can now be programmed. Understandings and behavior between people can be programmed. A smart contract that kind of has a bank inside the contract. And you do certain things, you abide by your commitments, the contract fulfills it. Now, a second or another big factor on the technology push is the physical world is becoming digitized. And we're going to need blockchain for that, too. It was waiting for that because, when that light bulb buys some power from a distributed source, and its reputation is enhanced as a trustworthy device because it promptly paid for the power, and the device functions under the demands and requirements of the owner. I want reliability, low cost, and green in that order, or something like that. That's not going to go through a central system. It's not going to go through Visa. Okay? We need a distributed and decentralized platform to do that. So, the world is demanding a different model, and now we have technology that's enabling a different model. So what actually happens? Well, in nature, there are all kinds of decentralized organizations. Now, this is really a 4-hour presentation, so I'm not going to go through all these, but, swarming, the murmuration, starlings. I'll talk about one of these later on. And nature finds a way to self-organize and create things that work. And over the years, different people have tried to put together decentralized human organizations, federated structures, co-ops, teal organizations, agility. That was a big theme back in the 90s. But again, the world wasn't demanding it and the technology didn't enable it. So what's really going on here to the firm? Do you know this guy, Ronald Coase? Anybody take economics? Nobel Prize winning economist. I raised him in 1994, and it was totally premature. I said, this guy's going to be the economist that will enable us to understand the impact of technology on the firm. And it's become true now. So let me just briefly explain. 90 years ago, Coase wrote a Nobel Prize winning paper where he asked a deceptively simple cost. He said, why does the firm exist? If Adam Smith is right, the open market's the best mechanism for allocating goods and resources in society. Why do we have firms? Why isn't everybody an independent contractor at every step along the way in production? And he said the answer, and he won a Nobel Prize for saying this, the answer is transaction costs. The cost of search, finding all the right people, money, and information in an open market, if you're trying to make something, that'd be prohibitive. The cost of coordination, getting them all to work together. We bring that inside the boundaries of a firm where the costs are lower. Of contracting, overall of establishing trust. So the traditional industrial age corporation was vertically integrated. It did do everything from soup to nuts. Henry Ford, within the boundaries of the Ford Motor Corporation, had a power plant, steel company, glass factory. Why? Because the costs of transactions in an open market were greater than the cost of doing things inside the boundaries of a firm. Now, in 1993, in paradigm shift, I said, no, I think the firm's going to open up because of IT. I called it the extended enterprise. Then in the 90s, we saw the rise of business ecosystems, or business webs. But these were still limited because they were about information. What happens when you bring this new era of Web 3 to the table? I think this demolishes transaction costs in an open market, leading to entirely new models of value creation. And that's the meaning of DAOs. The DAOs are not some cool way of doing something. They're a radical new way of organizing capability in society to innovate, to create goods and services, to govern ourselves, to manage. This is a profound change. They represent a profound change in the deep structure and architecture of the firm, the biggest since its creation. So this is a big deal. Now, what does it do, and what's the impact? Well, let's start on individuals. You know, the digital you knows more about you. You're the virtual image of you that you leave behind, because you don't know where you were a year ago, what you said, what medication you had, what diagnosis you had. But all of that data that you create gets expropriated from you by a new class, a new species of business. We call them a digital conglomerate. That's what Alphabet, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, fewer than 10 of them own half of the NASDAQ. This is a massive concentration of power because they own the asset, remember, of the digital age, which is data. So what if, using Web3, we could capture all that data, sweep it up into a self-sovereign identity that we own the data? Well, that would be important, and not for the reason that people talk about. First of all, sure, it would enable us to monetize the data. Jared Lanier says that there are 1.5 billion people who could double their income if they could monetize their data. But you could use the data to plan your life. You could aggregate the data together anonymously to do things like, say, stop a pandemic. And this would be key to protecting privacy. And people say to me, well, Don, privacy's dead. Get over it. You know, if you got nothing to hide, what's your problem? I think this is foolishness. Privacy is the foundation of freedom. And all this data represents our identities, and we need to get this data back so that we can manage our identities responsibly for ourselves. Now, each of these is a 1-hour talk. So if you got another 10 hours, I mean, we can go for it. But I think this is between now and a cocktail party, so I'm gonna pick up just 5 of these and do 1 minute on each of them. Financial services, it's the one where everybody starts. Anybody know what this diagram is? It's called a Rube Goldberg machine. He was an American engineer and cartoonist, and he built all these super complicated machines that would do something really simple like crack an egg or open a door. I look at the banking system and the industry, and I see something like that. It's not that hard, really. What does the industry do? It stores value, money, securities, value. Used to be in safes, now it's in computer systems. It moves value. It lends value. It funds activity with value, venture capital, private equity, mutual funds, hedge funds, and so on. All of these things can be done by software. And someone asked me earlier today in an interview, talk to me about fintech. You know, fintech is helpful technologies to enable better use of the existing institutions, like a new coat of paint on the wall of the bank. Whereas DeFi is the elimination of these middlemen functions. Now, that's not going to happen, sure, overnight, because the banks are smart and they're powerful and they're getting all over this. But the financial institutions are ready for a big shakeup. And my son Alex gave a talk on how blockchain is eating Wall Street. It was a TED Talk, and a lot of people watched that thing, including Wall Street. He was in Goldman Sachs 2 weeks later, and they were like, well, what's going on? Then our physical infrastructure, right now, it's all centralized. We need a decentralized physical infrastructure. Now, this is a big discussion, but I'll give you a reason that maybe you didn't think of. AI. The current hardware to do what we're talking about with AI is insufficient. You know what? We need to marshal all of the hardware in the world, including your laptop and the server down the hall from you. And the reason that we need a decentralized model, not just of the hardware, but of all AI, is because we can't go forward with this powerful technology when it's controlled by somebody else, where there's no transparency, there's no community governance. Everyone's talking about we need to regulate AI so that we don't lose our human agency and this stuff doesn't take over it. Well, there may be a rule for that. We need a whole new model of AI that we control. Decentralized physical infrastructure. The foundational language model should be open source. There should be community governance. We need decentralized ownership of data with transparency, accountability, attestation, and we need open applications. Now, if that sounds like a big job, it is. But it's not the fact that it looks overwhelming, is that a reason to not do it? No, it's called an implementation challenge, and it requires leadership, and I appeal to you. I don't have time to talk about this, but we're doing a whole program on this at the BRI I'd love to share with you. Science. The model of science is really flawed, and there are all kinds of areas where we're not having discoveries the way that we should. We have these silos of pharmaceuticals that don't share data. Government grants, we're going to give you some money and we want you all to compete. Don't talk to each other. And then the winner, we give you that money and they go off and do the research. Don't collaborate. And then you come back publishing and you write a paper 3 years later, and maybe we'll put that paper into a university or something, you can pay for it. What's wrong with that picture? Well, just about everything. So DAOs and other decentralized models of revolutionary science. The Internet of Information broke the business model of culture. You know, going way back, pre-industrial, culture was funded by patrons. The Medicis would fund artists, symphonies, and so on. Then under the industrial age, culture became more distributed. You're a musician, you could get a record and it would go out to a lot of people. And you get paid for it. Under Web 3, or Web 1 and 2, you had these streaming platforms. Do you know if you're a songwriter 40 years ago and you wrote a hit song, 1 million singles, you'd get $48,000 in royalties. Today, you get 1 million streams, you get $7. So this is a big problem. We have to fund culture. How are we going to do that? Well, under Web 3, we can have an artistic centric model with not just NFTs and DAOs and a whole distributed way where the creators of cultural value can also benefit from what they create. Then the same thing is true for supply chains, these centralized EDI systems and ERP and so on. And they don't work, so people are sending faxes and emails and phone calls and so on. What if all of that were a shared network state, a decentralized single version of the truth, where you could have real-time transactions, where you could have smart contracts that automate a lot of this activity without a central authority? This is powerful stuff. And then the same thing is true for the planet. You know, we have a big problem here. Some of you may not believe in science. Now, we're not in the United States, so I'm sure most of you do. But if we reduce carbon emissions by 95% in the year 2050, it's still going to take 1,000 years for the planet to cool down. And in the meantime, bad things are happening. You know, there are 1.5 billion people that are losing their water supply right now. And you've all seen the effect of climate in your area. This is caused by humans. And so, well, we have these carbon taxations. We're going to need a lot more than that. We're going to need a green digital infrastructure, digital green infrastructure, where we can track every single thing in an economy and know what carbon it's creating and how it can be reduced or offset. And this is a very powerful thing. You may have heard of DMRV. We got the people from Guild 1 here, James and Alexis, that are, you know, real world leaders, and I'm excited to collaborate with them. But the idea is that we tried to measure carbon as it goes through stuff. This can all be digitized on a blockchain. So you create a product, and you can know about the carbon it emits throughout an entire supply chain, and then you can figure out ways to reduce it or offset it by having a real-time single version of the truth. And this is a very powerful thing, and it's all, of course, a decentralized network. Final point on this. Oh, man, I'm out of time. Okay, I got to fly here. How can this be? That our economies are growing and the middle class is shrinking in many countries. How can it be that we have wealth creation and declining prosperity? Well, it's happening. It's got a lot to do with the digital age. And the big solution to this is called the redistribution of wealth, right? We're going to tax the rich more. Well, there may be a role for that. I mean, Elon Musk got to pay some taxes. But there's a whole different way of thinking about this that's a Web3 way. It's that rather than the redistribution of wealth, we could pre-distribute wealth. We could make our economy more decentralized, where people can participate directly in the economy and share in the value they create. And I'm trying to explain to you what you're doing and why it matters. This is changing the nature of the enterprise so that shareholders and workers are no longer different people. They become stakeholders. And there are many other ways that we can decentralize the creation of value too. I mean, remittances, that's $1 trillion ripoff. People shouldn't be paying 11% to send money back to their families somewhere. 70% of land titles in the developed world are not enforceable. So let's put those on a blockchain. Now, it's not easy because you have to have a valid land title in the first place. But there are many ways, Uber and Airbnb, the so-called sharing economy. These are not sharing economy organizations. They're successfully precisely because the owners don't share. They capture all the data. Let's put that on a blockchain. So all these cars are moving around. You can own a car. And it just drives around. It's part of the creation of wealth for you. So we need to think really differently about how we're going to solve these big social problems. The final one I want to talk to you about, a penultimate one, is this Metaverse, right? Is Yatsui here in the audience? He was here earlier. He said a very cool thing about what's happening here. So we have a Web3 model of the metaverse that we can access. And we're going to access it through wallets and VR and so on. But we can't have a centralized model. If it's Mark Zuckerberg creating the metaverse, Yat says it's like a theme park, like Disney World. You go there, and they set all the rules, and you pay, and you participate. They capture all the value. No. I mean, not to diss Disney World. You got some kids, take them there, and it's fun. But don't think it's going to transform the human experience, okay? So we need a Web3 vision where the metaverse is decentralized, where the creators of value own the value, where there's a currency, where there's transparency and community governance. So again, this theme keeps coming back and affecting everything about technology, but also everything about the way that technology is applied. And the final one is kind of personal to me because it's my new book. You heard it here first, the first time I talked about it on a stage. And it's being written with Joseph Bradley, who's the CEO of Autonomous, the technology company of Neom. And the idea is self-sovereign identity, data, right? What happens when that data is infused with intelligence? The virtual you becomes a digital persona that can act on your behalf, that goes to work with you. It's your co-pilot. It helps you remember stuff. It's helping you with your lifelong learning plans. It's helping you in every part of your life, measuring your body and making medical recommendations. If you're dating, you won't be swiping. Your virtual self will go on 1,000 dates and screen out all the losers and come up with a couple of good recommendations. Just let your mind go about having the smartest thing in the world being part of you. What are you going to store on board and off board? What tasks are you going to do and have that your digital, the multimodal you do? So this is a pretty juicy thing. You may have heard it here first. It's called agentic AI, agent, your agent acting on your behalf. Finally, how are we going to get there? We held a big meeting, Alex and I did, up at our lake house after the book came out, where we brought together the leaders from many different parts of this ecosystem. And a guy named Pinder Wan, who attended, said, just because it's decentralized doesn't mean it has to be disorganized. We need to steward the platforms, but we also need to steward these new models of the institution that are emerging. Now, there's lots of stuff that we can draw upon. If any of you are interested in this, if I had another life, I'd just spend all my time on this. Because we've had these old models, holacracy and so on, but they've been lacking the technology to make them really work. Now, we've got on-chain and off-chain, and we have a whole new platform for rethinking the nature of governance itself. And IOG was doing a project with BCG, and they brought us in to help bring some stuff together. And it ended up being a sort of a triangle like this. And at the top, we've got decentralized platforms. How do we determine how money gets allocated in these things? Vote? Well, it can't be all about voting. There's got to be other ways. Maybe consensus. Maybe we redefine consensus as the absence of sustained opposition as opposed to agreement. Maybe we assign certain people to make certain types of decisions. There are all kinds of new ways that we can think about the allocation of funds on a platform. And then we have the governing of platforms, which is broader than just how do we allocate funding. And below that, we have the governance of firms and decentralized businesses, DAOs, and so on. And then ultimately, we have governance of entire industries. You know, Fred Smith, the CEO of FedEx, the founder, he's now the chairman emeritus. I interviewed him at Consensus a few years ago. I did the opening talk. I brought him on stage, and he says, we're going to have to rethink our entire supply chain, and we need governance of a supply chain, of an entire industry. So this is a key enabler, but it's also a key roadblock right now because we're still learning. Now, a point that you probably haven't heard, you've heard talk about governance. As shareholders become stakeholders, you have to think about the platform is algorithmic. You know, it's got rules and it works. Now you can upgrade it, make changes to it, and so on. But it works. Whereas these shareholder ecosystems are malleable, they're dynamic, they require human intervention. And when you think about it, this is not just about governance, it's kind of about management. You know, the traditional model of management science has been around 100 years, but there are, I don't know, thousands of textbooks or of business schools. There are probably tens of thousands of textbooks. There's tens of thousands of management professors, all assuming a certain model of the firm and of how we orchestrate capability in society. We're going to have to rethink all of that non-trivial job. So, decentralization is different. It's an idea as time has come because there's a demand pull from a new environment and a technology push from this new Web3 that's blockchain meets AI meets IoT meets XR. Decentralized organizations have a very different architecture, and that's what we're doing, changing the nature of the firm. Every industry is going through a transformation like this, and what will the future bring? The future is not something to be predicted, it's something to be achieved, and everyone in this room has a role to play in governance and leadership for this new world. To close, paradigm shifts create a leadership crisis. Typically, vested interests fight against change. Leaders of the old paradigm have great difficulty embracing the new. You know, Galileo had a tough life trying to convince the church that the earth wasn't at the center of the universe. The leaders of Newtonian physics fought against Einstein's general theory of relativity. And so How are we going to find the leadership to bring about this change? Well, my call to you is that leadership is your personal opportunity, because it can come from anywhere in this new environment, not just from the top. And it's not the opportunity of the person sitting next to you or your boss or something. It's your opportunity if you will it. You might want to remember this slide or take a picture of it or something. Web3, Wall Street Journal bestseller. It's a beautiful book. Hey, he's my son. I'm a bit biased, but it's a great read. And it's the new book. We hope that it does for Web3 what blockchain revolution did for blockchain. We got another Tapscott here, former CIO of Citibank, has written a book about the trivergence of blockchain, AI, and the Internet of Things. And we're working away on this, trying to bridge the gap between the potential that I've described to you today and the actual deployment. So let me close. Oh, we're going to need the volume way down, please. Thank you. By showing you a system. Now, we've been studying organizations, but as alluded to, we've also been studying nature to see what we can learn from this. And bees come in swarms, fish come in schools, starlings, different parts of the world, over the moors of England, come in something called a murmuration. Have you heard that word? Murmuration. It's a word in the dictionary. It refers to the murmuring of the wings of starlings. And they're out over a 20-mile radius throughout the day doing their starling thing. They come together at night and they create this extraordinary thing. And it has a function. It protects the birds from predators. Yeah, you can see there on the right of the screen, that's a hawk. 25 times the size of a starling being chased away by the power of the little birds. Sorry, I can't quite hear the background. And scientists that have studied this say they've never seen an accident. And there's leadership, but there's no one leader. And when the moment is right, this magic happens. Now, is this some kind of, I don't know, fanciful analogy, or might we actually learn something about decentralization from it? This thing functions under all of the principles that I just described to you. Remember I said trust is not achieved by a middleman? There's no middleman. It's achieved by cryptography, collaboration, and code. This is a big collaboration, and there's kind of cryptography in the DNA of the birds that gives it certain rules. The big rule is don't get too far ahead, and don't bump into somebody else. That's the most important rule. But there are other rules too. Remember I talked about interdependence? I don't think business can succeed in a world that's failing. And the murmuration functions as if the interests of an individual bird are connected to the interests of the murmuration as a whole. And I talked to you about trust and integrity. This thing has a great integrity in the sense, well, let me explain. What is trust? What is trust? I wrote a book about this. 2 months, I didn't write a sentence, but I read everything on trust. I think I can describe it in a sentence. That trust is the expectation that the other party will act with integrity. Trust is the expectation that the other party will act with integrity. They'll do the right thing. Now, integrity means you're honest, you're considerate of the interests of me in a negotiation, you abide by your commitments, say you're going to do something, you do it, and you have a degree of transparency and openness. You know, the expression, what are they hiding, shows a relationship between transparency and trust. So this thing has integrity, which is why a little bird will chase a killer 25 times its size, because it trusts. It knows that the other birds will have its back. I don't know. What would happen if we link ourselves in this planet with some new network of glass and air and cryptography and intelligence? What kind of intractable problems could we solve? I look at this thing and I get a lot of hope that maybe this smaller, smarter, more decentralized world that my grandchildren inherit might actually be a better one. So, thank you very much.